Okay, guys, so here's the class for this week. As I said, on John Wiener's Hotel, or The Hotel Wentley poem. Sorry, I just need to cough. Mm. So, yeah, a bit of background about John Wiener's. You may have heard of him, you may not have, but he's an increasingly popular poet who, as I say at the bottom of here, while he was alive, he was very well respected amongst poets and amongst his contemporaries. But he's not someone who was as well known as some other queer poets from the same period. So he's often put in the same bracket as the Beats, for example, so as Allen Ginsberg or Jack Kerouac. But as we'll see, his poetry is significantly different from those guys. And as Wiener's reputation is growing, people are producing more and more work on him. More and more editions of his writing are being published, and yeah, we'll see more and more critical studies of his work emerging, I'm sure, over the time. And I think his reputation as a poet is likely to grow. But he's already very much admired amongst a certain circle of poets, both. He was both when he was alive and also now amongst a certain circle of poets and scholars. But he was born in Massachusetts. He's often associated with Boston as the city from which he didn't originate from Massachusetts, from Boston, but he was close to Boston. He is often associated with Boston, and you might hear him described as being a Boston poet. But he moved around quite a lot, and he studied at Black Mountain College, which some of you guys might have heard of. It was an independent kind of experimental arts school in Virginia, and he studied with major poets such as Charles Olson and Robert Duncan, who, if any of you guys are interested in the history of American poetry, both had a very significant influence on the history of American poetry, especially after the Second World War. And yeah, the poems that we're going to be looking at today are called the Hotel Wentley poems, and they were written, as I say here, in San Francisco between 1958 and 1960. And we might remember San Francisco from last week. Jason says that he took the name Jason in San Francisco, and that San Francisco is a place to be created, as he put it, especially to be created as a queer person, as someone who is experiencing non-heteronormative desire, and as someone who wants to live a life which is outside of the social norm and outside of the status quo, in terms of sexuality, but also in terms of a number of other kinds of alternative lifestyles that one might imagine. And in some ways, Wynne, as I say here, this isn't important for the Hotel Wentley poems so much in terms of the way that it affected Wiener's, because he actually suffered from this after writing the poems. But his life, to a large degree, was very significantly affected by the time that he spent in institutions, in psychiatric institutions, in which he was subjected to electroshock therapy and also to insulin comas, which was a way of heavily medicating someone with the assumption that the medication would cause the eradication of brain cells, which were causing strange behavior. And Wiener's homosexuality and his effeminacy as a person was included within this kind of strange behavior that he was seen to be exhibiting. He was also dependent on drugs for a lot of his life too. But I think the reason that it's worth thinking about this in relation to all of Wiener's writing is not in any way to suggest that he should be defined by what one critic has described as a kind of medical torture that he was put through, but because in some way it's indicative of the pathologization of alternative lifestyles and of queer lifestyles um, in the middle of the century, in the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s, the period in which Wieners was writing, and also the period in which he suffered as a result of this kind of pathologization, this understanding that queerness and homosexuality was something which was deviant and also something that could and should be treated with quite extreme kinds of medical intervention. And this had an extremely severe effect on Wiener's life, and it changed his personality. He kept writing afterwards, but he would write very lucidly about his time in institutions. Lucidly means clearly for anyone who doesn't know, and often calmly too. But it's undeniable that this had a very big effect on his life, and the effect that it had is indicative of the ways in which queer people and non-gender conforming people were treated during the period in which he was writing, which is why I mention it, even though it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the Hoto Wentley poems themselves. They were written in a context in which homosexuality was pathologized, and as we'll see, in which it was criminalized, and we can see elements of this in Wiener's writing. And in the class today, I want to draw attention to the ways in which, in Wiener's poetry, we see the consequences of a queer lifestyle playing out for us. And yeah, the final point is that he is often spoken of as being a lyric poet. When I use the term lyric poet, I mean a poet whose poetry usually expresses intense personal feeling. That's more or less the kind of standard definition of what lyric poetry is. It most often involves an I, so a speaking I, a person behind the words who one assumes is having intense feelings, and they're using the poetry as a way of expressing and communicating those feelings. And it's certainly true that Wieners was a lyric poet, and he wrote some extraordinary lyric poetry. But at the same time, it's also, I think, and this is something that a number of critics have pointed out, is that his poetry and his lyric is also very invested in expressing social conditions and expressing what it was like, not just for John Wieners as the I of his poems and as the person who was doing the experiencing, but also for queer subcultures, for a whole group of people, and he often uses his poetry as a way of developing a sense of community and showing what a community might be, while at the same time investing very heavily in this I and in this kind of personal emotion. And often this is again combined with, as I say here, with a treatment of poetry itself as something spiritual and something to which Wieners wanted to devote himself, something which is almost sacred for John Wieners, and for plenty of other people too. So with all these things in mind, what we'll do is we'll start off by looking at some of the social context for San Francisco in the 1950s, and especially in relation to the queer community in San Francisco. And then we will look at some of the poems, and we'll do some close readings of the poems and see how this kind of social life and this queer life come up through the poems, and maybe what the poems have to say about it and what it has to say about the poems. So we'll skip this bit. We'll go into San Francisco, then I'll go back to that. So we have a quote from Michael Roommaker, who was a poet who knew Wieners and who's describing the situation in San Francisco in 1959. It's not the only description of the situation that we have, or even that we'll look at in this class, but I think it's worth dwelling on and it's worth reading. And Roommaker is talking about queer friends and comrades in San Francisco at the time that Wieners published the Hotel Wentley poem, so in 1959. And he says, "We were isolated from each other by guilt and shame, and by the profoundly inculcated belief that we had no natural right to existence." So when he says inculcated, he means inculcated belief is a belief which has been constructed. If I inculcate a belief, I cause it to come about. So he's saying that the queer community, to some degree, had a belief that they did not have a right to existence, and that this was inculcated as a result of their social circumstances. And Roommaker continues, all that accepted and contagious determination that was embodied in the police, the judge, the assistant district attorney, the very law of the court itself, as microcosm of the entrenched ignorance of centuries of the broader society at large. There was no open ground any of us could share, no precedents for solidarity. So we will see some descriptions which contradict this statement, but it's certainly a sense that the queer community in San Francisco is very atomized at this point. So individualized, in isolation from each other. Without a lot of solidarity. And then he goes on to say, accept the writing as a focus and a center, a place. So for Roommaker, producing poetry, producing writing within the queer community was a way to ground this community, and was a way to ensure that people felt as if community existed. People felt as if there was a place. People felt as if there was a center to queer life in San Francisco at the time. And Roommaker goes on, and he means John Wieners here. He says, John has been beginning to speak up, plain in those strong early poems. A poem for the old man and a poem for cocksuckers. And we'll look at a poem for cocksuckers in quite a lot of detail. So on the one hand, we get a sense of San Francisco as being somewhere with a queer community, but at the same time, somewhere whose queer community was isolated and atomized and was not really sure how to relate to itself. And we have an understanding of poetry and the poetry of John Wieners as in some way or another enabling that community or playing a role in that community, coming to a sense of itself, and being able to form itself and having a center and having a ground. And often having a cultural output is something which allows a community to form and which enables a sense of focus and a sense of a center if you have a shared cultural output or you share a cultural tradition, which is what Wieners is contributing to with the Hotel Wentley poems. And as David Grundy, whose essay I've attached here, says at several points, this is a courageous thing to do. to be openly queer and to be writing queer poems in San Francisco at the time is a brave thing to do. And one of the reasons that it's brave is that the city, while having what we might call at points a thriving queer community, it was also a city which like America at the time and a lot of places was institutionally homophobic, which means that legal action, police action, and court action was to an extent focused on the eradication of people who were considered to be sexually deviant, either gender non-conforming or homosexual or both. This was a major moral concern for straight San Francisco in the 1950s, and it gets worse after 1955. And the second, I've uploaded 3 articles to eCampus. I'm mainly going to talk about David Grundy's essay, which is here, and this history of the relationship between queer life and the police and the courts in San Francisco in the 1940s and the 1950s, which is by Boyd. But as we go through this, we will see the ways in which specifically a certain image of a queer individual, and this recalls what we were talking about in the first week and the second week about homosexuality as a kind of identity which involves performance, but also at points historically has come to mean a self. The law has a big role to play in San Francisco in making in pushing this idea that there is such a thing as a homosexual, as a gender non-conforming person, as opposed to someone who just has sex with people of their own gender, or as opposed to someone who does not conform in whatever way to a kind of gender binary. The idea that these behaviors represent a person, a self, an inside that needs to be policed and needs to be eradicated is something which is a major part of the history of the policing of queer people in San Francisco, and this was very strong in the 1950s, especially after 1955. And we'll read through some of the extracts from this article, and then I'll come back to the Hoto Wentley poems, and we can think about the ways in which Wieners is challenging this kind of legally enforced homophobia, and is also kind of celebrating a kind of queer community. And we'll see some moments where the idea of what a queer community might mean is expansive in important ways too. So yeah, we have this quotation from the San Francisco Examiner in 1954, which is the epigraph for the chapter that I uploaded, which says, "There must be sustained action by the police and the district attorney to stop the influx of homosexuals." The district attorney is I'm sure some of you guys know this already, but it's the state prosecutor. So it's the one who if the state is bringing someone to trial for crimes against the state, so like corruption or bribery or dishonesty in civil office, it's the person who will prosecute those cases. So only police, so we hear too many taverns cater to them openly. A tavern is an old-fashioned word for a bar or a pub. So too many bars openly cater to gender non-conforming and to homosexual people, queer people, according to this this heading, this article from the San Francisco Examiner, which is a local newspaper. The San Francisco Examiner was a local newspaper for San Francisco. And we go on, only police action can drive them out of the city. So they're calling for a policing to literally drive out queer people from the city. It is to be hoped that the courts here will finally recognize this problem for what it is. And before the situation so deteriorates that San Francisco finds itself as a complete haven for undesirables. So undesirables are people of weak moral character. So we can call it a moral panic, which is a word from sociology, a term from sociology, which means when a particular political agenda is given a moral bent or a moral purpose, often involves the media. So we hear that the courts heretofore have failed to support the arresting and prosecuting authorities. Without the support of the courts, the police and the district attorney cannot attack the problem effectively. So essentially, 5 years before the Hotel Wentley poems are published, we have a vision of San Francisco as being somewhere in which a number of people are afraid that the city will become overrun with undesirables who are represented by the queer community. So there's a sense that the homosexual, the gender non-conforming man or woman or non-binary person is of a bad moral character, and that they will undermine the moral fiber of the city in some way or another. And this is the kind of depth of the homophobia which is pervading certain areas of San Francisco society. And in contrast to that, we have and again, this is covered in the Boyd chapter, which I've uploaded. We have the emergence and in some ways the thriving with difficulty of gay bars, of a kind of community where queer and where gender non-conforming people can meet and can hang out. And we have the sense that these bars are in tension with the police. If you read the chapter, there's descriptions of undercover agents working there a lot, trying to catch people who were deemed to be sexually deviant. And there's also descriptions of the way that they would arrange the bar in such a way that it meant that they could see police come in very easily, but at the same time it wasn't actually easy to get into the bar, and there would be back exits so that people could get out quickly if they needed to, if there was a raid or anything like that. So there was a real sense of bars providing a kind of public space in which queer life could develop, but also this being in tension with police harassment. We have bars the language that Boyd uses is bars that transformed a random or fleeting cohort of individuals into a collective. So bars that took individual queer people and helped them forge a kind of sense of collective queer identity. But against that, we have consistent police harassment. And again, we saw both of these when Jason is narrating his stories. We see San Francisco as somewhere to be created. We see San Francisco as somewhere with a queer community, which enables people to experience a kind of queer collective life, enables people to recreate themselves. And at the same time, we see San Francisco as somewhere, and New York as somewhere, where police harassment is a consistent feature of queer life. Um, and yeah, Boyd goes on to say, and this is important, both for the course in general, and I think for Wiener's poetry too. But part of, as I say, this program intensifies around 1955, and part of the thing that it does is taking the conduct, the acts of homosexual behavior, so having sex with people of the same gender or being gender non-conforming, and it turns it into a person. So we hear this after 1955, homosexual status was increasingly conflated with conduct. So to conflate something means to mistake or to replace one thing with another. So if we're saying that homosexual status was conflated with conduct, actions previously understood to be innocent, such as in the case of men, effeminate behavior, now signaled illegal behavior, such as sexual solicitation. So if you appeared to be effeminate, if you dressed in an effeminate manner, if you were camp, you now suggested that you were homosexual and were therefore likely to engage in kinds of behavior which were specifically illegal, such as solicitation. So sexual solicitation is essentially attempted seduction. And it could happen within the queer community. It can happen in a bar. Within any community, it can happen in a bar. It can happen on the street. It can happen anywhere. But it was illegal for queer men to engage in sexual solicitation. And what Boyd is arguing is that after 1955, we have a situation in which the mere appearance of being queer is enough to suggest that you are an illegal kind of person. So you no longer even have to really be caught doing specific things. You just have to give the impression that you are gender non-conforming or homosexual. And again, we read later in the chapter that the legal authorities of San Francisco collapsed the difference between homosexual status as a state of being, and conduct, behavior, and suggested that any behavior that signified homosexual status could be construed as an illegal act. So it wasn't just having sex with people of your gender, or even soliciting people of your gender to see if they wanted to have sex with you. It was being a homosexual that was considered illegal, as if there was some kind of essence in people that was homosexual, and those people were just illegal, undesirables, as it was put before, deviants. And this creates a kind of obvious possible paranoia, and we could call it a self-surveillance, in the sense that people would be increasingly worried about how they appeared to police, because if they, for example, if they were cis women and they had mannish attire, so mannish means like a man. It's not a very common word, but it is used. And attire is clothing. So if they had mannish attire, then they would be considered suspect if they were women. And for men, limp wrists, high-pitched voices, and or tight clothing became evidence of homosexuality, became evidence that you were a deviant, and also it became evidence that a bar or a place in the community should be shut down and should be legally attacked because it was hosting individuals who themselves, in and of themselves, in the core, were deviant and immoral. And again, we've seen this all the way through. There are big consequences for taking the acts that someone does or the mannerisms that someone has and assuming that it expresses a kind of internal consistent self, or acting as if it does. And we can see this here. We can see the way, and you can see more of it if you read the rest of the chapter, how important that idea was in developing anti-queer policing strategies and anti-queer laws in San Francisco at the time that Wieners is writing, or in the years before Wieners writes the Hotel Wentley poems. Okay, so let's come to the poems now, and we'll do a close reading of some of them. So this is a quote that I like from Amiru Baraka, Leroy Jones. He was originally called Leroy Jones, and then he changed his name to Amiru Baraka. He was also a very, very significant poet. Very different from Wieners. Baraka started out in the same kinds of what we could call bohemian circles in New York and San Francisco, but then later quite quickly became involved in militant African American organization, and as a result of that, relocated to Harlem and became very invested in the revolutionary potential of African American art and poetry. Despite their differences in personality, Baraka was a big admirer of Wieners, and we see this here when he says, "I read the book, put it down, forgot it, I thought. And then phrases, entire lines came back whole to me. I juxtaposed lines from one poem into others. They seemed to fit perfectly. I went back to the book. The second reading almost forced me to my knees." So Baraka is saying that he felt so moved by the poems in the Hotel Wentley poems that they almost forced him to his knees. And you guys may or may not relate to that feeling, but I feel as if it's a nice example of the kind of power that Wieners' poetry is sometimes thought to have, and of the way in which he has been able to affect readers since publishing his first poems, and this was his first book in 1959. So yeah, it was published when he was 24 years old. It was written in the Hotel Wentley over the course of 2 days, I think. So he wrote it very, very quickly. And the Hotel Wentley was a rundown hotel in San Francisco. And if we say something is rundown, we mean it's cheap. It's in bad shape, we could say. It's dirty. It's dirty. Things like that. So it's not like the Chelsea Hotel where we saw Jason speaking last week. It's a hotel which would have been stayed at by people who did not have a lot of money. And again, I do think we'll come back. Hotels will feature a few times on the course, and they are interesting spaces for thinking about queer life. Because as we were saying last week, they're spaces which are often either inhabited by those who have a lot of property and are on vacation or who can afford to live in hotels, or those who have no property and are either working in the hotel or are living in a cheap hotel because they have nowhere else to go. both of those people, both of those kind of types of people are potentially queer individuals, but the majority of the queer individuals that we will encounter and we will be talking about on this course would fit into the second category. They would be much more likely to stay at the Hotel Wentley than at the Chose Hotel, for example. And yeah, the other thing I want to say, which you can read if you read David Grundy's essay, which I think is a really good introduction to the Hotel Wentley poems, especially, is that these poems were inspired by a specific breakup with Wiener's long-term partner, who was a volunteer firefighter called Dana. However, these are not poems that are just about Wiener's own feelings. Rather, we could say something like Wiener's uses his own feelings as a way of elaborating and expressing more complex things about the nature of queer community, and also the nature of what he thinks poetry is and should be. And these two things come together. Sometimes they're both present in exactly the same line in a way which is kind of fascinating. Wiener's is a poet who, if sometimes when you read him, you can see 2 or 3 or 4 meanings happening at once, and it's impossible to tell if any of them have priority over the others, or if they are all to be taken as happening at the same time. And his poems work on a number of levels at once. Okay, so now that I've given quite a long introduction to the poems, let's have a look at them. And the first poem that I will read is the first poem in the book, in the Hotel Wentley poems, which is called A Poem for Record Players. And we have this opening stanza, which almost immediately combines a number of different ideas about queer life and about poetry and about Wiener's own personal relationships. So we have the opening line, the scene changes, then 5 hours later, and I come into a room where a clock ticks. I find a pillow to muffle the sounds I make. I am engaged in taking away from God his sound. And something that David Grundy points out in his essay is that God, as we read Wiener's poems, we can know that God was Wiener's code word or code name for Dana in his journal that he was keeping in the years prior to the Hotel Wentley poems. So we see lines in Wiener's journal like this one crossed out: God is knocking at the door, and in a minute it will kiss and wrap its blonde arms around me. And God just kissed me and called me the suburban poet. So when we see a line like, I am engaged in taking away from God his sound, we see both a memory of a queer relationship, and we also see, like I say, this kind of sense of devotion to poetry, as if poetry was God's own sound taken away from him and put on the page. And again, before this, we have this line, I find a pillow to muffle the sounds I make. And in some ways, this could be a very sexual line. Are the sounds that he's muffling sounds of pleasure? And if so, is he muffling them because he needs to make sure that when he's being intimate with his partner, with God, he doesn't make too much noise and he doesn't let people know what he is doing, because if the hotel found out what was happening in the room, they might evict them. Wiener's might lose his place to live. And if we remember in Portrait of Jason, something that we hear, one of the stories that Jason tells is about staying in the YMCA. And we hear that he was ejected from the YMCA because he started sleeping with someone within about an hour of getting there. And he was kind of kicked out straight away because it was considered to be morally unacceptable. And I think in these lines we have a sense of something which is quite intense and potentially erotic, but which is also responding immediately to the to circumstances of surveillance and to the fact that if Wieners was to be caught in a hotel type situation, in a homosexual situation, then not only would he likely have been evicted, but he could have been prosecuted too. So we have both devoted, almost a love poem, a deeply erotic poem, and we have a poem which is reflecting the kind of mannerisms and the kind of secrecy which was required as a part of a queer lifestyle in San Francisco. And we go on with this kind of sense of heightened awareness. And he says, the pigeons somewhere above me, the cough a man makes down the hall, the flap of wings below me, the squeak of sparrows in the alley, the scratches I itch on my scalp, a landing of birds under the bay, window out my window. And again, the pigeons may be a reference to informers, like a stool pigeon. A pigeon is someone who informs for the police. We know that undercover policing was a way in which San Francisco tried to clamp down on its queer community. But it also might be speaking of a kind of heightened awareness that comes from love or comes from sex, a sense of living in the moment as a queer poet. And he says, details, but which are here, and I hear and shall never give up again, shall carry with me over the streets of this seacoast city forever. Oh, clack your metal wings, God, you are mine now in the morning. I have you by the ears, in the exhaust pipes of 1,000 cars, gunning their motors, turning over, all over town. And yeah, in some ways, again, I think we have a similar movement here. Oh, clack your metal wings, God, you are mine now in the morning. Especially if we read Grundy and we read God as Dana, as Wiener's former partner, or as God and as God, as both God as Dana and God as God. We have a kind of combination of a very intimate relationship and this sense that the poet that Wiener's is and wants to be is someone who feels as if they are tapping into something, something deeply important and something almost sacred. And within that sense, there's a kind of queer relationship at the core. There's Wiener's relationship with Dana, which enables him to maintain this combination of feelings and maintain this this dual meaning of the idea of God, and have a kind of theological, poetic sense sitting alongside a sense of two lovers in the morning. And he says, I have you by the ears in the exhaust pipes of 1,000 cars, gunning their motors, turning all over town. We have a sense of the city as being very busy, as being very bustling with 1,000 cars, but also something deeply personal, this sense that he has God by the ears. And in that way, again, there's a kind of potentially aggressive eroticism here, which refers both to a sense of the sacred, a sense of God, and also to Wiener's own personal life and his own relationship with a person who has most directly inspired these poems. If we look at the next poem in detail, two, poem for tea heads, and tea is a kind of drug which several poets on the scene, of which Wiener's was a part, the queer poetry scene, were interested in taking. Um, it was related to Benzedrine, um, if anyone is interested. Um, and it's a description of a bar. It's a description of a kind of, or what we assume is a bar. If it's not a bar, it's certainly a description of a kind of queer community. And it's a poem for tea heads. And again, something that Grundy points out is that with these titles, we both get the sense that they are dedicated to tea heads, to people who enjoy this drug. And at the same time, if you are reading this poem, there's almost a logic to it which suggests that if you are reading this poem, you are a tea head, because this is a poem for tea heads. So why would you be reading it if you weren't a tea head? So something about these poems is also creating a sense of collectivity, as we've talked about, and it draws the reader into that immediately. And we see these kind of characters coming up with this. So he says, I sit in Lee's. I think we assume it's a bar, but maybe it's a house. Maybe they're gathering at a house or a bar. And he says, at 11:40 p.m. with Jimmy the Pusher, he teaches me juju. Jimmy the Pusher is a real person. Jimmy the Pusher was someone who, an African American man who Wiener's knew on the scene and was friends with. Apparently, he didn't like being featured in the poem, but he was a real person. And again, it's part of a kind of underground community to. And naming these people by the names that they are known by within the community, again, it draws people in. And he says, he teaches me juju. Hot on the table before us, shrimp foo, yong rice, and mushroom chow yuk. Up the street under the wheels of a strange car is his stash. The ritual, we make it. So again, there's a sense of drug dealing, there's a sense of criminal behavior going on, and there's a sense of a subculture which is, we could say, is outside of the law in some way. So it's a subculture which is, or which consists of and contains a variety of people who are not just queer, but also drug dealers, working class African American people, people who, for whatever reason, are, we could say, ostracized, who don't find it easy to integrate or don't want to integrate into a stable, legal, social world. And this is part of what I meant when I suggest that Wiener's poetry gives us a sense of queer community, which is quite expansive. We'll talk about this more in the next poem that we look at. But the ritual, we make it and have made it for months now together after midnight. And again, there's a double meaning in this. If we say we make it, we make the ritual, it might mean that we constitute the ritual. The ritual happens because of us. And we have made it, so we have made it before. We have made the ritual previously. But at the same time, there's a sense of relief. right? There's a sense of, to say that you have made it, to say I have made it, means I'm safe, I'm okay, I made it. And we have a sense of danger, we have a sense of subculture, we have a sense of deviancy, but we also have this sense of relief in the middle of the poem, as if we can breathe, as if something about Wiener's relationships with these people and in this bar or this house is making him feel as if he's made it. But then we move on, for months now together after midnight. Soon I know the fuzz will interrupt, will arrest Jimmy, and I shall be placed on probation. The fuzz is another word for the cops or the police. So we have a sense that immediately any sense of having made it is perhaps impermanent and is not something that we can really trust or really rely on. And again, that's part of what it means to be queer in San Francisco in the 1950s, is the persistence of police harassment. At the same time, Wiener's lines suggest that part of what it means to be queer in San Francisco is also this sense of escape, this sense of having made it, this sense of relief. And then he goes on to say, the poem does not lie to us. We lie under its law, alive in the glamour of this hour, able to enter into the sacred places of his dark people, who carry secrets glassed in their eyes and hide words under the roofs of their mouths. So he's figuring poetry, or he's imagining poetry as something which is able to, in some way, encapsulate and to preserve a moment. We lie under the glamour of this hour, this moment, this point in time, able to enter into the sacred places. So able to understand things and able to enter into places that perhaps are not available outside of this hour, or outside of this community that Wiener's poems are participating in and also are establishing. And we hear about people who carry secrets glassed in their eyes and hide words under the roofs of their mouth. And again, I think that we can think about these lines as a kind of partly, not entirely, but partly as a description of a kind of dissimulation, which means pretending to think or feel something that you do not, or hiding something that you do think or feel. Which, as we've discussed, would have been a feature of queer life and would have been a feature of being a drug dealer as well. It's all about trying to change your mannerisms in order to be able to survive and in order not to be identified as someone who should be harassed by the police and potentially taken to court. So when we hear about these people who carry secrets glassed in their eyes and hide words under the roof of their mouths, it sounds almost supernatural. It sounds almost magical and religious, but at the same time, it's also speaking to a kind of actual living queer community in which people would be hiding their feelings when they were out in public in a place where they were not safe to be themselves. But also, if you were a member of that community, then those people might contain beautiful secrets for you, and the words that they have under the roof of their mouths might be fascinating, and might be of solidarity and of intimacy and of erotic love and all these things that one might be interested in if one was a part of the queer community in San Francisco. So these tensions are working all the way through Wiener's poems, I think. And we're not going to read all of them because we don't have time. But the other poem that I want to read in some detail, and then if we have time, we'll read a poem for early risers. But the other poem that I want to read in detail is a poem for cocksuckers. And again, this does something similar to a poem for tea heads, which is that in some way, and Grundy makes this point in his essay, it we could say it interpolates the reader, or it interpolates. Is that not how you spell interpolate? How do you spell it? Oh, no. It interpolates, which means that it puts something or someone in a context which they do not, in which they do not put themselves. I know it's a very similar word in French, but just making sure that you know exactly what it means. And yeah, this is a poem which the title is a derogatory term, so the title is an insult. To call someone a cocksucker is not to call someone something positive, but at the same time, it's an ode to cocksuckers. It's in support of them. It's dedicated to them, and in some way or another, it kind of pulls the reader in a way that might make some readers feel uncomfortable potentially, but for other readers opens up a kind of place and a role within this community, which Wieners and his friends and the people he meets are constituting. And again, it's we start in a bar. We can go in the queer bars. We are long hair reaching down to the ground. And we can sing our songs of love like the black mama on the jukebox. After all, what have we got left? Oh, our right, the fairies. On our right, the fairies giggle in their lacquered voices and blow smoke in your eyes. Let them. It's, I'm not going to say that word, world, and we retain strength. So this is a difficult poem for obvious reasons, because it uses the N-word. Also because of the kind of reference to the stereotypical black mama on the jukebox. The way that I read this and the way that I think it can be read, and to me the most obvious way of reading it is that this is a kind of expansive solidarity with other groups who are also suffering disenfranchisement, police harassment, and having a pretty bad time in America. And this is what I mean when I say that Wieners' queer poetry feels like it's expanding, feels like the idea of queerness is not just related to, or is not related to only sexuality and gender, but is also related to a kind of fact of being socially excluded. So as much as we wouldn't use that word in a poem, or as much as a white poet probably wouldn't use that word in a poem now, or if they did, they would be criticized for it. I think we can read Wieners here as using it in a way which is connecting certain facts about African American life with certain facts about queer life. And I do think there is a sense of solidarity in the way in which he uses this word, in a way that perhaps an African American person might use it, for example. And we could say that that isn't something we would do now. Baraka was probably the most militant poet, African American poet of the century, and if he's okay with Wieners, then I think that we can be generous about the way in which we read the use of this word. That's all I'm saying. I'll stop talking about it now. But I think that this is part of the whole expansive queerness that I'm talking about. And of course, though, if it would be perfectly acceptable for someone to find the use of this word deeply troubling, and I can understand why someone might not like it. To move on, though, we have a kind of affirmation and a kind of support again of cocksuckers and also of the fairies who giggle in their lacquered voices and blow smoke in your eyes. Let them. Smoke in Your Eyes is also a reference to a song, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which was sung by Billie Holiday, who Wieners was an enormous fan of. And the whole poem is painting this sense of a community which can support itself, this sense of a community of cocksuckers and fairies and other disenfranchised people who have a kind of strength and a beauty to them. And they use words which are used to disparage them and they turn them around. So a fairy is also a homophobic word, a homophobic slur. And he goes on to say, so we retain strength. The gifts do not desert us. The fountains do not dry. So the gifts do not desert us can be read as saying, like what it is which is beautiful and brilliant about being queer or being a member of another group does not go away. It's permanent. It stays with us, and we keep it together, and we keep it alive in our community that we have, and that this poem is both reflecting and is contributing to. The fountains do not dry. This does not go away. There are mountains swelling for spring to cascade. And then he says, it's all here. The powdered legs and painted eyes of the fairy. It's all here between the powdered legs and painted eyes of the fairy. So again, we have this sense of erotic community, erotic queer community, a sense that everything, life, sensation, and overwhelming beauty is there in this one individual, in this gay bar, which is representative and is hosting the community, or is able to host the community on this one occasion. And then he says, friends who do not fail us. So again, a sense of consistency, a sense of solidarity. Mary in our hour of despair. Wieners was raised Catholic to a degree. There's a lot of Catholic imagery in his poetry. But he ends with two lines which are worth thinking about. When I say that sometimes Wieners' poetry feels like it contains 2 or 3 different meanings at once, sometimes even more. But he says, take not away from me the small fires I burn in the memory of love. So these small fires could either be fires that Wieners himself is burning. So he is burning small fires in the memory of love. And this could be the love of the other members of the queer community. He could be burning a fire for each person in this community who falls in love and is able to express that as a result of the base that San Francisco, even though it's an antagonistic and even though it's a difficult base, it's nonetheless an existing base that San Francisco is able to give people, to give queer people for community. At the same time, we can entirely break the line here, and it can again become a very personal line about Wieners' own one love, about Dana. And he could just say, take not away from me the small fires, full stop, here I burn in the memory of love. He is burning in the memory of love and the memory of his relationship with Dana, which is now ended. And again, this is part of what I mean when I say that Wieners' poetry sometimes feels like it can slip between being very, very personal and being about community. And the same the same two lines or the same three lines contain both meanings. There's no one meaning. No meaning is more right than the other. But part of that means that no specific community can exist without the individual. There is no community of small fires who are burnt in the memory of love without the one John Wieners and the one everyone else who is also burning in the memory of love. And yeah, maybe a final thought for what Wiener's poetry is doing in relation to the sense of community that he contributes to and that he develops throughout the poems is showing how this community forms an individual, and also showing how this individual, this poet, is able to contribute to and to form the community. And you can't have one without the other. And I think there's something quite amazing in Wiener's poetry about the way that he can have the same two happening at the same time in the same lines. We have the same individual and community happening at the same time in the same lines. All of which is taking place within the context in which to be queer and to be openly queer and to write openly homosexual poetry and to publish it is a very risky thing to do. So I think that we should read the Hotel Wentley poems. You guys may not be that interested in them. You may not like poetry very much. But I think that they exist as a testament both to a particular kind of queer community in San Francisco and also to John Wiener's own bravery in being a queer poet and existing as openly homosexual in a moment in history in which that was not it still is not an easy thing to do. But a moment in history in which it carried very clear and obvious legal consequences. Okay, guys, so the task for this week is to write a response to the Hotel Wentley poems. I haven't taken you through all of them. I've only taken you through a few, but hopefully you can read the rest if you want to, if you enjoy them. And yeah, if you want to write a response, then write a response. Let me know if you find any of them moving. Do you find any of the poetry troubling? Is it difficult for you? Is it something that you would be critical of? And yeah, do you feel like the poems reflect elements of queer life which are still present today, or do you feel as if they feel like they're really a product of America in the 1950s? And sorry, I'll just correct that. Should say the poems. So yeah. I hope that you're enjoying the course. I hope that some of you enjoyed Wiener's poetry. If you did, I would really recommend getting hold of the selected poems from Wave that I showed you in the introductory video. And of course, send me the feedback. Send me the response by email if you would like to give me feedback, but also send me what I'm trying to say is put the posts on the forum if you would also like to share it with the other students too. So yeah, and for next week we will be reading Verity Spot's Trans Manifestos, and I will put the page numbers and a PDF of Testo Junkie online later tonight. But the main thing is read the Verity Spot, and there will be some references to Testo Junkie as I go through the class on Spot. Okay, guys. So speak to you next week. Bye.